Hello and welcome to iBridged Leadership Stories. I'm your host, Jeff Harnois. My guest today is Nicole Martin, an HR executive extraordinaire. Nicole is a dedicated and insightful HR leader with over 20 years of experience in leadership development across global companies, fast-growing startups, and boutique consulting firms. So quite a range there of experience. She specializes in empowering leaders and managers to unlock their full potential, guiding them through strategic decision making, organizational growth, and personal development. Nicole is an expert in aligning leadership, enabling successful mission outcomes. She has a razor sharp focus on identifying leadership gaps, and then, through an elegant and refined empathetic approach, she coaches leaders in their own growth and development. Her focus in fostering deep, trusting relationships enables her leaders to deliver record level revenues and profitability. In addition, Nicole holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry, so we're probably going to nerd out a little bit today, and an MBA from NYU. Please join me in welcoming Nicole Martin to the stage today. Nicole, welcome.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much.
It's such a pleasure to have you here, and I'm excited about this conversation. I didn't
Yeah.
mention in your intro that you also have certification in the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team program, and I think we'll probably talk about some of the elements of that program and more. I'm excited for the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. Anytime I have a chance to geek out about people stuff, I'm all in.
Awesome. Me too. Me too. So let's talk a little bit about vulnerability-based trust, which is one of the foundational cornerstones of the 5 behaviors program. I know you've got some perspectives on vulnerability, and I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just to go back to the 5 behaviors, it's a program that I instantly fell in love with because it was so easy to understand. Each level builds upon itself. And so felt very much more tactile and attainable than the typical leadership book that you read about or team building activities. So the fact that trust is at the very bottom of the pyramid is saying how important that piece is.
Mhm.
And I think some people, when they hear that, they're like, well, obviously we need to trust our colleagues, but I the trust that they talk about in the 5 behaviors is significantly different. Trust, as I think most people define it, is, and I'm going to, put something out there that you may or may not agree with, it's self-serving. It
Mm.
is on the surface about, being selfless and helping a team. But if you really dig deeper, trusting your colleagues is more about you than them. It means that you have a smoother, more productive, and ultimately better work environment. It reduces your stress. You don't have to micromanage. And yes, the end, there's collective success.
Mhm.
Each one of those in itself, they don't really sound too bad, right? But yeah, it can be better. And that's why I really like how trust is defined within the 5 behaviors.
Okay.
It's based on vulnerability, which means colleagues are openly admitting mistakes. They're asking
Mm.
each other for help and they're sharing uncertainties. They're going into that space where things don't necessarily feel good. But what this does is saying that I'm trusting you to help and not to judge. And as soon as you take that ego out, the perspective shifts immediately to something way more
Mm.
selfless.
A couple of things are coming up for me, Nicole. One is, and I suspect we'll talk about psychometrics a little bit later, psychometrics being the measurement of psychology. And when we understand a psychological overlay to a behavioral program like 5 behaviors and then narrowing down on trust, I often think about the psychometric disc, everything disc. And so when we look at D and C types, trust is often operationalized in what I would call a transactional manner. One of the ways to think about that is do what you say you're going to do. And if you do that and you're consistent in doing it, then I'm going to build trust for you. But when we look at the I's and the S's in the DISC modeling, trust is much more relational and relationship oriented. The way that I would think about that is if I know that you've got my back, then I can trust you, right? It's also, when you're talking about vulnerability, I just want to make that tie in really quickly here. I think vulnerability based trust is probably easier for people who have that relationship trust orientation. And therefore, the value in looking at D types or C types and helping them sort of adopt or add vulnerability to their own trust matrix, as an example, really expands their ability not only to build trust, but to earn trust of others. What do you think about that?
Oh my gosh, I totally agree, Jeff. And, I think being aware of how other people learn to trust, how they work, how they communicate, that overall awareness makes a stronger team. And
Mhm.
going back to the psychometrics, what if you have a really high performing team, you are going to have all pieces of that disc pie there. And
Mhm.
so there needs to be a way to bring everyone together and align them.
I love that you brought it back to the team perspective because that's exactly right. When we have a common, think of it as a social contract, but for teams, when we have a common understanding of the behaviors that we want to promote and also the behaviors that we don't want to accept in our team, we no longer have to figure that out. We can focus on the mission and stop focusing on how we're going to work together.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is probably a good time for me to kind of tell a story about that
We would love to.
because yeah, because it's easy to talk about these things in theory, but to actually see it in action brings so much life to what we're talking about here.
Mhm.
And, my first experience with the five behaviors was when I was consulting as an outsourced head of HR for a company that was undergoing massive changes.
Mhm.
They had just doubled in size over only a couple of years, and they were experiencing major market shifts. The CEO was pushing for leadership to do things differently and be more strategic. And I don't want to be too dramatic, but if things didn't change at this company, they would eventually cease to exist. They were
Wow.
looking, they really needed to make changes in order to continue to be successful. So,
There was a lot
um,
at stake here.
I'm sorry.
There was a lot at stake here.
Yes, there is a lot at stake. And it, when you have that much pressure on a team, it's, you see folks go back into what they know. And so what they really needed was to come out of their comfort zone and be
Mhm.
pushed into a place where maybe they felt a little uncomfortable and but in a way that would progress change. And this is where you and I were introduced, and I got to hear more about
Mhm.
the five behaviors, and immediately knew that this was going to be great for this
Yeah.
team. Yeah. So, to give a little bit more background on the team, the reason why these changes and the transition was difficult is because the way I would describe them even today, and I no longer work with this company, they're very nice. They're just nice people. They're you can have a great conversation. Everyone likes each other, which is great, right? You want to work with nice people, but they would say they trusted each other, but it was in that transactional sense. They
Mhm.
didn't, if you took a step back, you didn't actually see any of that vulnerability. They tended to overanalyze and overthink things, make excuses when things were not going right, and not learning from their mistakes. The same thing would happen over and over again. And as a result, they weren't as client focused as they needed to be. That's
Mm.
why all of this was so important.
Oh, I love that connection, Nicole, because what I just heard you say was how they approached trust and how they approached interacting with each other, which was, friendly. um, I would use the word respectful, which is always a good place to start. The trust wasn't in place. And then I'm guessing because the trust wasn't really foundational, their ability or even desire to then have conflict around questioning and
Yes.
challenging decisions that were being made ultimately led to a less than desirable outcome with client engagement. Is that what you're saying?
100%, Jeff. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. So, scheduling this five behaviors training, which included a disc assessment, this was all new for a majority of folks on the team. So,
Mhm.
it really helped to spark massive self awareness of how they
Mhm.
work and communicate and awareness of others. And the exercise that stood out the most, and I believe Heather Gilly had said the same thing when she was on your podcast. Yep, it was the personal histories exercise.
Mhm.
Everyone shared information that we had not previously known about one another. It was more about their families, their backgrounds, their culture. There were deeply personal stories about childhood trauma,
Mhm.
narratives of self doubt. So we've all really got to know everyone's authentic selves, not just the workplace persona that folks put on in the morning when they log in. So that made a huge difference because for the first time, probably, they had an opportunity to be vulnerable in the workplace
Mhm.
within a safe space.
What did that experience translate into for them, would you say? How Let me ask that question a little bit differently. How did they transform as a team after going through that exercise?
Yes. I love how you rephrase that because as a team, ended up opening up their minds to more possibilities,
Wow.
understanding who their colleagues really were, stopped the assumptions. Well, this person's going to say this because this is how they are, or this is how they always were.
Mhm.
Having shared those personal stories, I saw exponential compassion. And it really
Wow.
allowed them to embrace the known and unknown. So, knowing what changes were coming down the road, they were ready to take them on. And then seeing later on some unknown changes that they were hit with not long after this training, they were a stronger team for it. And saying, okay, what do we need to do? Let's get together. Let's, have real conversation and not make excuses anymore. We need to do things differently. Let's do it.
Mhm. Wow, that's phenomenal. That's
Yeah.
phenomenal. I'm reminded of a segment that I observed with Simon Sinek. Most people are familiar with Simon and his work. He was doing some work with the Navy SEALs, arguably some of the highest performing, highest stake teams on the planet. And he was talking about trust with them. He wasn't using a five behaviors lens, but there was a really close parallel. He said, one of the ways that they think about trust is certainly that transactional trust where people have to do what they say they're going to do. But real trust for them, he uses a phrase like, I may trust you with my life, but do I trust you with my money and my wife? I thought from a vulnerability standpoint, that's really raw and it sort of cuts right to the chase. And I just love the tie into what you're talking about with this particular team, that exercise puts people in a vulnerable state where real relationships can be formed.
Yes, it has definitely made for a stronger team. And, you know, that's why I wanted to talk about trust today and vulnerability based trust. It goes, and this foundation even goes beyond the definition of trust, however you want to look at it. Vulnerability, especially, it opens up awareness of yourself and others. And when you're able to consider other possibilities, I really believe it makes you more innovative, creative, empathetic. And these are all traits that I think anyone would want, but especially leaders will thrive if they embrace these sorts of traits.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Well, Nicole, from my perspective, it seems like any organization, any organizational leaders that you are supporting and partnering with are going to benefit deeply from your experience, your skill set, and your competencies in navigating these very often complex, complicated, and sensitive topics. Yeah, brilliant. One of the things that we had talked about previously is this idea about the differences in communication styles. And we've talked a little bit about DISC and psychometrics. You're familiar with DISC. I know you're certified in it. I think you've used Myers-Briggs, and then you've used some others as well. Talk a little bit about how other people's communication styles, one, how maybe they can get in the way of effective decision making, leading to effective outcomes, but how to sort of navigate and then ultimately master that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I'll just say to start off, at the end of the day, humans do not communicate well. That's something that it's kind of a mantra of mine to keep in mind that if someone's not communicating well, that's just in our nature. And that includes people like myself and you and folks who really make an effort. We're going to mess up from time to time, and that's okay. But again, if we're aware of that, if we know our own communication style, we can help set up the situation and kind of foresee where there might be bumps in the road. And one of those, something that I often see both in the small businesses I've supported and also the massive global companies I've worked for, leaders will have a vision and they want to execute this vision. In the middle, there's alignment, right? You need to get folks aligned. So crafting a
Mhm.
vision, building alignment, and then champion execution. It it's not easy to do. It sounds
Mm,
like a very simple three-step process, but
mhm,
that communication piece tends to get in the way. And I've seen that, like I said, in small companies. So one of
mhm,
my prior clients was literally a small mom and pop shop. And they wanted to, when the son took over the business, they wanted more structure and policies and definitions to help set
mhm,
expectations for managers and employees because they had never had that before. And there were
mhm,
massive inefficiencies in running the business.
mhm.
So, for example, they never had a discipline policy. And this was really important because it was mainly an hourly workforce.
Mhm,
And so you
mhm,
had folks not, showing up for work, no call, no show. They're showing
mm.
up late, they're abusing policies. And so there was no repercussions. And it was getting a little out of control. So the owner had this vision of building more alignment and really wanted to have those guardrails of policies to put in place. And you would think that in a small business, this would be easy. Small because there's very few employees. But what ended up happening was that at the end of the day, it was not properly communicated outward. And there was a
Mm.
lot of influence from long-term senior level employees who were having trouble aligning to that vision and
Yeah.
understanding where it was going. So, in this case, there was a lot of history there that made it very difficult to implement the change and execute on on these new policies and procedures.
Mhm.
And if there was broader communication, if there was, you know, I think mainly really just sticking by the vision and trusting in that vision. Guess what? We're talking about trust again, trust among
Right.
each other.
So the modeling that you're referencing comes from a book. Dr. Mark Scullard was one of the key authors. I think Susie Kuckerman was also one of the co-authors. A book called Work of Leaders. And Work of Leaders is exactly that. It focuses on vision, alignment, and execution. And there's an assessment component that goes with that particular program. And what's really interesting about it from my perspective, interesting and a little bit, I would say, ironically funny, we'll go into an organization and we will assess those competencies, vision, alignment, and execution. And what we often find is that those teams are good at two of the three of those, vision, alignment, and execution. They're not good at the third. And here's the ironic part, they often don't realize, they don't have that awareness that they're not good at the third. And so when we do that assessment and then we're able to show them, it's amazing to watch the light bulbs go off. Oh, we're really strong on vision and then we want to move right to execution. We're focused on excellence and execution. It's like, okay, but you missed the alignment step. And so you're wondering why the team isn't on board or they're not executing in the way that you want them to be. Or another example would be, our priority is excellence and execution, and we do a really good job aligning ourselves around that, but there's no vision component. How are you moving the business forward? Here's your current state today, but where do you want to be? And what's the idea? What's the plan? What's the mechanism that's going to get you there? And when we reflect that back to them, it's the awareness goes off the chart and they immediately know what they need to work on and fix to become I guess, comprehensive in all three of those, or skilled in all three of those, getting the result they're looking for.
Right. Yeah. And, it's never easy, but I love that Work of Leaders has that ability to shine the light right in people's faces to say, hey, here's where you're great. Here's where you need help, and gives some format to build on those skills.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. And I think it's worth saying too that the example I just given was a very small business, but even with large corporation, they can still struggle in this space and might even struggle to even build awareness here because everything is so layered and bureaucratic, and there's a lot of red tape, so to speak, to go through. And what I've observed, the largest corporation I worked for years ago was Unilever, and they are so matrixed and so big. They often did a really good job of communication and rolling things downward. But I saw some stumbles there as well. We're all human. We don't always get it right.
100%.
And when I was a business partner there, they were moving to a performance-based culture, meaning there's a really strong emphasis on measurable results, accountability, and continuous improvement, and where there wasn't prior. In other words, employees could no longer just do the bare minimum and be okay, make their bonus, get promoted, and all that. The North American leadership team crafted a really clear vision, and there was a lot of alignment built within HR. We were all on board. We were trained. We understood the assignment. And it was also our job to help roll this out to our client groups. And we felt very prepared. But then when I was at the point of rolling out to my client group, I realized really quickly and very last minute that senior directors were not aligned. So the most senior executives were, but it only went down to a certain level.
Right.
And in the middle of, an offsite function and rolling out this new initiative, I had senior directors questioning me on the spot. So, it was really hard for these discussions because it was in front of their teams, and clearly you're not going to get a lot of buy-in if your own director is not bought in. And unfortunately, what that really does, it kills credibility, whether it's with HR or senior leaders. It makes it really, really difficult.
I would take that a step further, and I would,
Sure.
because there is a flow, right? There's an upstream and a downstream here. What I mean by that is, again, you can have a really great vision, but if you miss on the alignment component, your execution is not going to be what you want it to be, and it may be so far behind that the initiative actually fails. And to your point, senior directors aligned and bought in, but if that next level of what I call a junior executive isn't on board, the teams that they lead are also not going to be on board. And so it's almost impossible to have excellence in execution when you miss that alignment step.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, we got it done. We didn't really have much of a choice, but it wasn't as smooth as it could have been.
Right. Yeah, in fact, that's also another really interesting observation from my perspective. I'm a big fan of doing great work, having a great approach and strategy, and then focusing on excellence and execution. But for me, I actually want the people who are engaged to enjoy the process, enjoy the work, feel good about the work that they're doing, get a reward, from being able to go do excellent work. And for me, the alignment piece of that is almost always critical for people to, feel satisfied and gratified in the work that they're doing, that we've minimized confusion and chaos and conflict because we took the time and had the discipline to really focus on getting the alignment component right. So that's one of my, I guess I would call it a specialty in terms of what I focus on. Since we're having this little confessional, I will also tell you that execution is probably my struggle. I don't
Mhm.
have a detail oriented mind. I'm not very process oriented. I am much more big picture. So my natural strength is on the vision side and on the alignment side. And when it comes to execution, I usually need a lot of help. I have that awareness. I want other executives and other leaders to have their own awareness about their strengths and their blind spots so they can bolster them so that every idea turns out to be great at the end.
Yes. And I mean, this is probably a great place to round back to psychometrics because I really believe that's the best way to have those awarenesses of oneself. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? How do you like to operate independently with others? It's really eye opening. And as I was thinking through our, prepping for our conversation, I remember as a kid taking quizzes in like teen magazine to find out like what best nail polish color I should wear. It's kind of like that, but like really functional and really applicable and useful.
I love the whole assessment component. Anytime you can objectively look at your current state, whatever the attributes are that you're looking for or measuring, anytime you can get clarity around future state, then the blind spots and the gaps become really obvious. And back to that idea of having awareness around those things, it just goes up exponentially. It allows you. I heard a statement once that really resonated with me. A well-defined problem is a half-solved problem. And so that awareness piece of what are the gaps, what do I need to focus on, you're halfway there.
Yes.
Let's jump into psychometrics a little bit more.
Great.
You have command of some that I haven't, I'm familiar with and aware of, but haven't used much. Let's go a little deeper there.
Sure. So, the one that always comes to mind, and it's really where I started embracing psychometrics more. I had been exposed to MBTI earlier in my career, but when I was at Unilever, there was a big push to roll out insights discovery.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It has the colors and the
Mhm.
bricks, and each color had a definition. I was very strongly blue, cautious and precise. I really loved
Yeah.
information and thinking about things. And I'm also, by nature an introvert, so it makes a lot of sense.
Mhm. Oh, can I insert here quick, Nicole?
Of course,
Blue is also the color of the S style on the disc model.
it is, and I am an S. So it all comes together.
Yeah, no coincidence for sure.
No, not at all. So they also have like green, which was someone who's more caring and encouraging. Yellow was the social side, the eye of disc. And then there was red, really fiery, competitive, demanding. And this was rolled out both to the HR teams and also our client groups, which was a great way to understand more of how I prefer to operate and how my colleagues operate as well.
Mhm.
And right around this time, I had gotten a new manager. There was some rotations that were happening within management. And my manager, and if she's listening to this, she knows who she is because it's going to be really obvious. She was the complete opposite of me. So my two
Mhm.
dominant colors were blue and green, and hers were yellow and red. And
Mhm.
what I love about us knowing that is that when we first had our initial conversation to say, hey, we're now going to be working together, she said, I know what your colors are. Mine are the opposite. Let's be aware of that. Just
Wow.
know this is how I tend to operate. And I
Mhm.
understand how you tend to operate. And she
Mhm.
gave me permission to call out when there were differences
Ah,
if I was not comfortable. She
mhm.
set expectations immediately from the start,
Love that.
which was so good, especially for, a blue like me who's very cautious and didn't like to call things out. I think I've gotten
Mhm.
better with that over the years, but at the time, it really helped build our relationship. So there was a funny story along with this. She sat in a different office in a different state. And so our relationship was very much by phone.
Mhm.
And one day she called me and said, Nicole, I really need you to work on doing X, Y, and Z. And it's really important. I need you to get it done right away. Here's some more information. I'm going to email you. Okay, bye. And I'm on the phone going, wait. You said I could call you out whenever I needed to. I need you to pause right now. And she's like,
Mhm.
oh, okay. What do you need to know? I'm like, I have so many
Yeah,
questions.
yeah.
And
Mhm.
then I got to ask my questions and feel more comfortable with the information she was giving me and what she was asking of me. And it honestly brought down my anxiety. And
Yeah.
we had a really good working relationship because it was those expectations were set out from the very beginning.
Yeah, I love everything about this story, Nicole. I also have been around psychometrics, gosh, for more than 3 decades at this point. And some of the things that I've learned about psychometrics in particular that relate to your story, when we do a psychometric assessment, again, the measurement of psychology on an individual, we know so much about them. And then they, of course, can know that about themselves. We know about their approach to decision making. What information do they need? What depth of detail do they need? Are they thinking about it strategically? Are they thinking about it tactically? We understand their communication style. We understand their stress and conflict style. We also understand how they approach trust and that sort of thing. And when you know those things, I call this decoding the human component of
Mhm.
leadership, right? It is a decoder ring. When you understand that about yourself first, then you understand how you're showing up to others. But your ability then to read the needs of others goes up exponentially. And your boss, in this case, operationalizing her knowledge around the psychometric in your specific profile, and then creating space for you to say, wait a minute, I need something else. You're decisive, you're driving, you're ready to go, but I'm not there yet. I need more information. I maybe need to slow the pace down a little bit before I can speed up. I need to get that foundation in place. And once I'm there, I'm ready to launch. Her ability to recognize that your style was not her style, and that wasn't a bad thing, it's a good thing. And her to be able to sort of leverage it is probably one of the best use cases I can imagine, understanding why psychometrics are so important. Phenomenal story. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. And I love something that you just said, Jeff, that understand that we were different isn't a bad thing. It's a good
Mm,
thing. That's also what I love about psychometrics. There's no wrong answer.
no
It
right
is
answer.
truly just stating like fact. I
Yeah.
like a lot of information. I'm going to ask questions. I need time to reflect.
Mm,
That's not wrong. That's not bad. And knowing that and learning that pretty early on in my career too helped me learn how to navigate conversations with people who are not like that, who are asking
mm,
things of me in real time and I wasn't comfortable with. One of the phrases that became very common in my dialogue with others, especially supporting client groups as a business partner, is saying, I hear you. I need to think about this for a moment, or I need to look something up to just confirm something. Give me a day or give me an hour,
mm,
whatever it was, no matter how urgent. It gave me that space to like sit in my own thoughts and reflect and analyze and feel comfortable responding confidently and
mm.
accurately because that's very important to me too.
Mhm. Right. Well, Nicole, thank you very much for sharing all of that information. Deep, rich, insightful. And again, it just feels to me like any organization that you're working with already has a competitive advantage with you being able to help them sort of unlock and decode their leadership capabilities, and ultimately their leadership potential. I love that entire arc. I want to pivot just briefly here. I have some questions that I ask all of my guests, and I'd love to walk you through them as well. The first one, and please feel free to have fun with all of these. But the first one
Okay.
was, what was the best advice you were given and didn't take?
The best advice I was given and didn't take 100% network always. I again, I am an introvert. Cold calling and reaching out to new people is just so blah, I don't like it. And I've known over early in my career, everyone's like, you should keep in touch with people, reach out to people, just say hello, ask a question. It's not a big deal to build a relationship. Well, to me, it was a big deal because it
Mhm.
felt so uncomfortable. And I really wish I pushed myself to do that sooner.
Okay.
Done it more as I've gotten wiser, but older and wiser, but for
More
sure.
to come for you there, by the way.
Oh, absolutely.
There's
Yeah. No,
more
that'll never
wisdom,
stop at this point.
more wisdom coming your way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another question that's always on my mind. I think about this a lot myself. What advice would you give to yourself? If you could wave a wand or push a button and go back 20 years or even further, whatever makes sense for you. What advice would you give to your younger self?
I would tell myself to trust my gut instinct
Hmm.
because I'm someone who likes data and information. I often feel most confident making decisions that are rooted in information. But sometimes it's important to listen to what your gut's telling you. And if
Mhm.
something feels good or doesn't feel good, that's, you should listen to that and
Mhm.
sit a little bit more deeply with it. Talk about it with someone
Mhm.
and find out why you're feeling a certain way. Um, you know, you mentioned at the beginning, gets very buried, as I told you before we started, gets very buried on my resume at this point. But I did major in chemistry in
Right,
college.
right.
Yeah, and if I took my own advice, if I had my older, wiser self talking to my younger self,
Mhm.
I would have gone into psychology probably
Mhm,
because I
mhm.
really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed people. Not ironic that I fell into HR where it is the business of people.
Right. Yeah. That's a really interesting look back. One of what's coming up for me while you were talking is, one of Amazon's leadership principles is be right a lot. And when I think about what it takes to be right a lot, there are people who are always going to default to data and logic and accuracy, which is not my strength. My strength is in intuition. And so it is that gut level processing of information, taking in information from all kinds of sources and making decisions. But I think in order to be right a lot, it's probably a combination of those two things. That's interesting. Okay, last question. What advice would you give to your peer group, other HR executives? Something that's meaningful or purposeful for you.
I would recommend trying to see the best in others and seeing good intentions. It's, we're not going to turn this at all into any kind of current events discussion, but there's so much of, critiquing others, especially in the workplace. If someone does something wrong and immediately jumping to they should have known better and maybe they're not right for the role. I think it's really important to keep an open mind and get curious about, well, what happened to get to this point? Because oftentimes folks don't act in a way that they're purposefully trying to mess up or do something not good. It happens because there are mistakes. And as we mentioned a couple times in this podcast, you are human. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to
Right.
mess up.
Right. Yeah.
So keeping an open mind and being curious about where that other person is coming from, it's really helped me navigate some super complicated issues, both in my career and personal life. And I think it continues to help build my empathy and compassion, which I think is a strength that we could use more of in the workplace.
Yeah, I love the empathy and compassion component. Obviously, I think that's critical to any HR leadership. I think being able to sort of teach empathetic responses to executive leaders is probably critical for the role.
Yes.
That's excellent.
Yes.
Nicole, I'm so grateful for having you on the show today. I loved your insights. I love your perspectives. I enjoyed having you. Thank you so much for coming.
This was so much fun, Jeff. Thanks for asking me to be on.
Welcome. You're very welcome. And we'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Take care.
Let's see you next time.